Some decisions are loud. They spark protests, headlines, and immediate resistance. Others are quiet. They are signed behind closed doors, justified as temporary, reasonable, or necessary, and then never revisited again. This is the story of one of those decisions. A decision that did not destroy gold, did not move it, did not even deny its existence. It simply made it unreachable. The gold was known, surveyed, confirmed. It still exists today, but a single decision ensured that no one would ever touch it. Not miners, not investors, not the communities who expected their future to depend on it. This is not a story about corruption or conspiracy. It is a story about authority, caution, and permanence. Before we continue, if you're interested in real stories about gold, power, and the irreversible decisions that quietly shape history, this channel focuses on documented events, not legends or speculation. These are moments when one choice closed every other option. By the time this gold became a subject of discussion, the era of reckless expansion was already ending. Governments had learned the cost of uncontrolled extraction. Environmental damage was no longer abstract. Conflicts over land and resources had left scars that were impossible to ignore. Gold was still valuable, but it was no longer seen as harmless. In regions where this deposit existed, multiple interests overlapped. There were mining claims waiting for approval, local communities hoping for development, state authorities concerned with control and long-term stability. At the same time, the land itself carried strategic importance beyond gold. Its location mattered. Its geography mattered. Its future potential mattered more than immediate profit. Allowing extraction would have triggered a chain reaction. Roads, population growth, infrastructure, political pressure. Once that process began, it would be almost impossible to stop. From the perspective of those in power, the choice was no longer about gold. It was about containment. The question was not whether gold should be mined, but whether opening access was a risk the state was willing to accept. And for the first time in the region's history, the answer leaned toward restraint. The power to decide the fate of this gold did not belong to a single person. It belonged to an institution. By the time the deposit entered official discussion, authority over the land had already shifted away from local actors. Independent prospectors no longer controlled outcomes. Private companies could not move without approval. Even regional governments operated within limits. The final authority rested with federal decision-makers, agencies tasked with balancing resource extraction against national interest. These were not idealists. They were administrators. The responsibility was not to maximize profit, but to minimize risk. They reviewed geological reports, environmental assessments, land use studies, and security evaluations. They consulted military planners, infrastructure agencies, and legal departments. Each group viewed the gold through a different lens. To geologists, it was a proven resource. To economists, it was a variable. To planners, it was a trigger. To strategists, it was a liability. The decision was not emotional, it was procedural. And because it came from an institution rather than an individual, it carried a unique kind of permanence. Institutions do not reconsider easily. They protect precedent. Once authority consolidated at that level, the future of the gold stopped being a local matter. It became a policy question. And policy rarely moves quickly, especially when doing nothing feels safer than acting. Contrary to popular belief, the decision was not binary. No one simply chose between mine the gold and ignore it. Several options were formally considered. Limited extraction under strict supervision, delayed development pending further study, restricted access combined with future review, temporary protection with defined reassessment dates. On paper, these compromises looked reasonable. But each option carried consequences that extended beyond mining itself. Limited extraction would still require roads, workers, and enforcement. Delayed development would not stop speculation or pressure. Temporary protection would demand future political courage to reverse. Every alternative opened doors that could not be easily closed again. The most decisive option was also the simplest. Close access entirely. Remove the question from the agenda. Eliminate future pressure. This approach transformed uncertainty into finality. No extraction meant no infrastructure. No infrastructure meant no population growth. No growth meant no political momentum. The gold would remain where it was, and the system would remain stable. From an administrative perspective, it was the cleanest solution, and once that logic took hold, other options began to look reckless by comparison. What made this decision powerful was not its boldness, but its ability to end discussion. The decision did not arrive with ceremony. There was no public announcement marking a turning point, no single document labelled as historic, no speech explaining what was about to be lost. Instead, the moment passed quietly through internal memorandums, formal classifications, and administrative language that concealed its permanence. Reports were reviewed one final time. Recommendations were summarized. Risk assessments were prioritized over opportunity. The gold itself was no longer the subject. What mattered was control. According to later archival records, the decisive step came when the land containing the deposit was reclassified under a protected or restricted designation. The language varied: security, preservation, Federal Reserve, strategic land use, but the effect was the same. Access ended. Mining claims were frozen. Exploration permits expired without renewal. Future applications were redirected or denied. No force was required. No confrontation followed. The system simply closed. For those outside the process, nothing seemed to happen. For those inside it, the outcome was already irreversible. Once the designation was finalized, reversing it would require a new political consensus, something far more difficult than approving extraction in the first place. This was the moment when gold stopped being a resource and became a liability, not because of what it was, but because of what it would attract. From the perspective of decision makers, the choice was not driven by hostility toward mining or profit. It was driven by risk calculation. Opening access would have triggered consequences that extended far beyond gold itself. Population growth would follow. Infrastructure demands would multiply. Environmental oversight would become permanent. Political pressure would intensify. Once extraction began, it would be almost impossible to stop without conflict. By contrast, locking access created predictability. No roads meant no settlements. No settlements meant no long-term obligations. No obligations meant administrative stability. Gold could remain underground indefinitely, and the state would not need to manage its consequences. In internal assessments, the value of control outweighed the value of extraction. The gold was seen not as an opportunity, but as a destabilizing factor. Allowing access would introduce uncertainty into regions that planners preferred to keep quiet, contained, and strategically flexible. This was not a rejection of gold. It was a preference for order. And once that preference was codified, it became self-reinforcing. Every year that passed without extraction made reopening the question more difficult. The decision protected itself. The consequences of the decision were not dramatic, and that was precisely what made them effective. There were no protests because access had already been limited. There were no lawsuits with momentum because claims expired quietly rather than being denied outright. There was no public debate because no single moment announced that debate was necessary. Mining companies adjusted their plans without confrontation. Exploration teams redirected their efforts elsewhere. Investors recalculated and moved on. On paper, nothing collapsed. But on the ground, everything stopped. Equipment that had been staged for surveys was removed. Temporary access roads were never upgraded. Support services that had prepared for future demand quietly dissolved. Local communities felt the change first, not as loss, but as absence. Jobs that were expected never appeared. Infrastructure that had been discussed was never built. Population growth that had been projected simply failed to happen. The gold did not vanish. What vanished was momentum, and without momentum, development has no mechanism to begin. Within a few years, the region returned to administrative silence. The deposit remained listed in official records. Maps still marked its location. Reports still referenced its value, but functionally, it no longer existed. The decision had achieved its goal, stability through inaction. At first glance, it seems obvious that no one benefited. The gold stayed underground. No wealth was created. No economy was built. But the benefits were real, just not visible in the usual way. For federal authorities, the decision eliminated a long-term management problem. No infrastructure meant no maintenance. No population meant no services. No extraction meant no environmental liability. The land remained predictable. For planners and strategists, that predictability mattered more than potential profit. It preserved flexibility. The region could later be reassigned for military use, conservation, infrastructure corridors, or remain untouched without conflict. For institutions, the absence of activity was a form of success. It meant few variables to manage. Meanwhile, the gold itself became irrelevant to those benefiting from the decision. Its value existed only hypothetically. Stability, control, and reduced responsibility delivered tangible returns. Even without revenue, the beneficiaries were not miners or investors. They were administrators. And their gain came from preventing change, not enabling it. The losses created by the decision were not recorded in budgets or balance sheets. They appeared in lives that never changed. Local communities were the first to feel it, not through collapse, but through stagnation. Towns that had anticipated growth remained small. Services that depended on expansion never materialized. Young workers left in search of opportunity elsewhere. For independent prospectors and small operators, the loss was final. They did not lose investments. They lost access. Their claims expired without confrontation. Their plans dissolved without appeal. Because the decision was administrative rather than punitive, there was no clear moment to resist it. Mining companies lost potential, not assets. Investors lost possibilities, not capital. Communities lost futures they had quietly prepared for. Even regional governments felt the loss indirectly. Tax bases never expanded. Infrastructure funding was redirected elsewhere. Economic diversification stalled before it began. The most profound loss, however, was invisible. Knowledge. Once access ended, research slowed. Exploration ceased. Understanding of the deposit froze in time. The gold remained underground, but so did the data that could have refined its value. History rarely counts what never happened, but absence can be just as consequential as destruction. Many decisions are temporary in theory. This one became permanent through inertia. Reversing it would have required alignment across multiple institutions: legal, political, environmental, and economic. Each had developed its own reasons to maintain the status quo. Over time, new priorities emerged. Budgets shifted. Leadership changed. Urgencies evolved. The gold, untouched and unseen, slipped further down the agenda. Each year of inactivity strengthened the original decision. Environmental baselines adjusted to non-use. Administrative systems adapted to absence. Communities stopped asking. What began as caution hardened into precedent. According to later policy reviews, reopening access would have required more justification than approving extraction ever would have in the first place. The burden of proof reversed. Gold needed to explain itself, and it never did. The decision did not survive because it was perfect. It survived because nothing forced it to change. The gold is still there. It was never removed, never depleted, never denied. It exists in reports, maps, and geological records, unchanged by time. What changed was access. A single decision transformed gold from a resource into a concept, from something that could shape lives into something that merely existed. No disaster followed. No scandal forced reconsideration. No crisis demanded reversal. The decision worked exactly as intended. It created stability by eliminating uncertainty. It reduced responsibility by preventing change. It preserved control by locking possibility away. And that is what makes it so powerful. This was not a decision made in ignorance. It was made with full awareness of what was being set aside. The gold was known. Its value was understood. Its consequences were anticipated. And still, the choice was to do nothing. History often focuses on action, on wars, discoveries, revolutions. But some of its most lasting outcomes come from restraint, from choices that feel reasonable in the moment and irreversible later. The decision to lock this gold away did not shape history through force. It shaped it through absence. Communities never formed. Economies never emerged. Conflict never happened. And because none of that occurred, the decision escaped judgment. There was no visible harm, only invisible loss. So the final question is not whether the gold should have been mined. The real question is this: when those with power choose stability over possibility, who is responsible for what never gets the chance to exist?